A mother disappears without a trace. A son dies under mysterious circumstances before he can testify against his father. A desperate woman shoots a police officer trying to break her lover out of jail. And at the center of it all, a charming farmer whose dark secrets would tear apart a small Illinois community. This is the complete story of the Charlotte Grabbe murder case, a tale of domestic violence, betrayal, and justice that took 7 years to achieve. Today we're diving deep into one of the most complex murder cases to ever rock rural Illinois. This case has everything: a missing body, a key witness who feared for her life, a family torn apart by violence, and a web of lies that took investigators years to unravel. Before we begin, I want to warn you that this case contains descriptions of domestic violence, murder, and other disturbing content. Viewer discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Now, let's travel back to 1981 to a time when secrets could be buried on an 800-acre farm, and a woman's cries for help went unheard until it was too late. Charlotte Sue Gore was born in 1942, a woman who dreamed of a simple life in rural America. When she married Fred Grabbe, it seemed like that dream might come true. Fred was a successful farmer who owned an impressive 800-acre spread near Marshall, Illinois, just over the Indiana border from Terre Haute. The Grabbes operated their farm in Clark County, but no one would call them an all-American family. There was too much turmoil, too much distrust, too many battles. Fred Grabbe was a complicated man. To the outside world, he appeared to be a pillar of the community, a successful businessman, a charming neighbor. He was described as a large, hulking man with an undeniable charisma that drew people to him. But those closest to Charlotte knew the truth about what went on behind closed doors. The marriage was marked by Fred's pattern of infidelity and increasingly violent behavior. He had multiple affairs throughout their marriage, each one a devastating blow to Charlotte's self-esteem and sense of security. Friends and family members would later testify about Fred's abusive conduct toward his wife. By 1981, Charlotte had reached her breaking point. She was 39 years old, a mother who had endured years of emotional and physical abuse. The final straw came when she discovered Fred's relationship with a young woman named Vicki McAllister, but Charlotte's fears went far beyond just another affair. She had discovered something that made her believe her life was in immediate danger. Charlotte had uncovered what she believed was criminal activity involving Fred and his business associate, Dale Kessler. According to Charlotte's own handwritten notes, she suspected them of stealing farm equipment. Oil pushers from Mattoon and Decatur, with serial numbers removed and stored in Fred's trailer by the machine shed. The equipment was allegedly being kept at Dale Kessler's shop at Darby Hill and at the Flom Lightwood place. These weren't just marital problems anymore. Charlotte had stumbled onto what appeared to be an organized theft ring. Charlotte made the brave decision that so many abuse victims struggle with. She decided to leave and file for divorce. But unlike most domestic violence cases, Charlotte knew with terrifying certainty what this decision might cost her. On July 23, 1981, just one day before she would disappear forever, Charlotte sat down and wrote what would become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in criminal history. In her own handwriting, Charlotte wrote, "Fred and I are getting a divorce, and I'm not sure I will not be killed through all of this. I'm trying to get the farm out of it." These weren't the paranoid fears of an abuse victim. They were the calculated observations of a woman who had discovered too much about her husband's criminal activities and knew the price of that knowledge. Charlotte placed this note in a safe deposit box at the First National Bank of Marshall, creating a paper trail that would later become crucial evidence. She was essentially writing her own death warrant and sealing it in a vault, hoping that if something happened to her, investigators would find her final testimony. It was an act of incredible foresight and courage from a woman who knew she was running out of time. Charlotte had moved in with her son, Jeffrey, seeking refuge from Fred's increasingly erratic behavior, but she knew that distance alone wouldn't protect her from what she had discovered. The weight of Charlotte's discovery was immense. She wasn't just facing the end of a marriage, she was sitting on evidence that could send Fred and Dale Kessler to prison for years. The stolen equipment she had documented represented thousands of dollars in agricultural machinery, and the systematic removal of serial numbers indicated this wasn't a one-time crime, but an ongoing operation. Charlotte understood that her knowledge made her incredibly dangerous to Fred's criminal enterprise and equally dangerous to herself. July 24th, 1981 began like any other sweltering summer day on the Grabbe farm. The Illinois heat was oppressive, the kind that makes tempers flare and decisions seem more urgent. Charlotte had been staying with her son, Jeffrey, but she needed to return to the farm to collect some of her belongings. What happened next would become the centerpiece of one of Illinois' most controversial murder trials. According to the only witness, Charlotte arrived at the farm that evening to gather her things. Fred was there along with his latest girlfriend, 29-year-old Vicki McAllister. McAllister had met Fred in her mother's tavern some weeks before July 1981. She admitted that she had dated Fred and had sexual intercourse with him prior to Charlotte's disappearance. The scene was set for a confrontation that had been brewing for months. Charlotte determined to reclaim her independence and expose what she had discovered about Fred's criminal activities. Fred, unwilling to let go of control and desperate to keep his theft ring secret, and Vicki, caught in the middle of a domestic situation that was about to turn deadly. When Charlotte's daughter Jenny called the farm that night looking for her mother, Fred had a simple explanation. Charlotte had left after another argument. He claimed she had stormed out, taking her car and driving away in anger. It was a story he would stick to, even as the evidence began to pile up against him. But Charlotte's family knew something was wrong immediately. Charlotte was a devoted mother who would never disappear without telling her children where she was going. She had plans, commitments, a life she was trying to rebuild. The idea that she would simply vanish into the night was inconceivable to those who knew her best. As the hours turned into days, Charlotte's absence became more ominous. Her car was found abandoned miles away from the farm, but there was no sign of Charlotte herself. The vehicle showed no signs of struggle, no indication of where she might have gone. It was as if she had simply evaporated into thin air. For 3 long years, Charlotte's disappearance remained an unsolved mystery. Her family lived in agonizing uncertainty, not knowing whether she was alive or dead, whether she had been kidnapped, murdered, or had somehow chosen to disappear. The investigation had stalled, with no physical evidence and no witnesses willing to come forward. Then, in 1984, everything changed. Vicki McAllister, the young woman who had been Fred's girlfriend at the time of Charlotte's disappearance, made a decision that would alter the course of the case forever. After years of carrying the burden of what she had witnessed, she finally went to the police. McAllister's testimony was shocking in its brutality and detail. According to her account, she had been present on the Grabbe farm on the evening of July 24th, 1981, when Charlotte arrived to collect her belongings. What started as a heated argument between the estranged couple quickly escalated into violence. Vicki stated that she watched as Fred Grabbe grabbed Charlotte by the neck and strangled her. He strangled her until she began to lose consciousness, released her neck, then strangled her again. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of uncontrolled rage. According to McAllister's testimony, Fred's actions were deliberate and sadistic. He would strangle Charlotte until she was on the verge of unconsciousness, then release his grip, allowing her to gasp for air and regain awareness, only to repeat the process again and again. The location of this horrific crime, according to Vicki, was the farm's tractor shed. According to Vicki McAllister, she had seen Fred Grabbe attack his wife in the shed, where the tractor was stored on July 24th, 1981. According to McAllister, Fred had hit her on the head and killed her, but McAllister's testimony didn't end with Charlotte's death. What she described next would shock even seasoned investigators and prosecutors. After Charlotte was dead, according to the witness, Fred's depravity reached new depths. She testified that Fred sexually assaulted Charlotte's lifeless body, then used a grease gun, a tool commonly found on farms for lubricating equipment, to fill Charlotte's body cavities with flammable fluid. It was an act of such profound violation and desecration that it defied comprehension. According to Vicki McAllister's testimony, Fred Grabbe's plan to dispose of Charlotte's body was methodical and chilling. After placing Charlotte's remains in the 55-gallon drum, Fred loaded it into the back of his pickup truck and drove toward the Wabash River, which formed part of the border between Illinois and Indiana. The Wabash River was a logical choice for someone trying to destroy evidence. Its waters were deep and fast-moving, capable of carrying away any traces of the crime. But Fred's plan went beyond simply dumping the drum into the water. At the riverbank beneath a towering maple tree, Fred positioned the drum according to McAllister's account. The location was strategic. The tree would provide cover from any passing boats on the river, but it would also become an unwitting witness to the horrific crime that was about to take place. Fred doused the inside of the drum with diesel fuel. The flammable fluid he had used to fill Charlotte's body, combined with the diesel fuel, created an intensely hot fire that would consume not only Charlotte's remains, but also any physical evidence that might link Fred to the crime. The fire burned for hours beneath the maple tree, reducing Charlotte's body to ash and bone fragments. The heat was so intense that it scorched the earth and affected everything in the immediate vicinity, including the tree itself, though no one would realize the significance of this for years to come. When the fire was finished, Fred dumped the remains of the drum and its contents into the Wabash River, where they would be scattered by the current and lost forever. Charlotte's skull was the last part to burn, and according to Vicky's testimony, Fred picked it up and callously remarked, "This will make good fish bait," before throwing it into the river. Meanwhile, Vicky McAllister had a crucial role to play in the cover-up. She followed behind Fred's truck in Charlotte's own car, helping to maintain the illusion that Charlotte had simply driven away from the farm after their argument. They drove Charlotte's car to a location several miles from the farm and abandoned it there, creating a false trail that would confuse investigators. The plan appeared to work perfectly. For 3 years, there was no body, no physical evidence, and no witnesses willing to come forward. Fred had seemingly committed the perfect murder, eliminating not only his wife but also any trace of his crime. But the psychological toll of witnessing such brutality and of participating in the cover-up eventually became too much for Vicky McAllister to bear. The guilt and fear that had kept her silent for 3 years finally drove her to seek justice for Charlotte. Unknown to Fred, the maple tree that had provided cover for his heinous act had been silently recording evidence of his crime in its very DNA. While Fred went about his daily life maintaining the facade of a concerned husband whose wife had simply left him, Charlotte's children refused to give up hope. Her son Jeffrey and daughter Jenny knew their mother would never abandon them without a word, and they were determined to find out what had really happened to her. Jeffrey Grabbe had witnessed firsthand Fred's abusive treatment of his mother throughout his childhood. He would later provide crucial testimony about Fred's violent tendencies towards Charlotte and what would become pivotal evidence in the eventual trial. However, during their investigation, authorities made a crucial discovery that would transform the case. Charlotte had left letters in a safe deposit box at the First National Bank of Marshall, where she expressed her fears about not surviving the divorce proceedings. The letters mentioned her concerns about Fred and his business associate Dale Kessler, transforming the missing person case into a potential homicide investigation. This discovery gave investigators specific leads to follow and provided crucial context for Charlotte's disappearance. The family organized search parties, distributed missing person flyers, and kept Charlotte's disappearance in the public eye. They contacted local media, hoping that publicity might generate leads or encourage witnesses to come forward. Their persistence and refusal to let the case fade away put constant pressure on law enforcement to continue investigating. Jenny Grabbe, Charlotte's daughter, became the family's primary advocate. She worked tirelessly to keep her mother's case active, maintaining contact with investigators and following up on every potential lead. The emotional toll on Charlotte's children was immense. They were grieving a mother they hoped was still alive while simultaneously fighting for justice in a case that seemed impossible to solve. The family's suspicions about Fred grew stronger over time, especially after learning about Charlotte's written fears. His behavior after Charlotte's disappearance struck them as callous and inappropriate. While they were desperately searching for any sign of their mother, Fred seemed unconcerned about his missing wife. He made no effort to join the search parties, showed little emotion when discussing Charlotte's disappearance, and appeared to be moving on with his life as if nothing had happened. This stark contrast between the family's anguish and Fred's apparent indifference would later play a crucial role in the prosecution's case. The combination of Charlotte's letters and Vicky McAllister's detailed testimony was compelling. But Sheriff Dan Crumrin had an idea that would provide unprecedented scientific support for their case. Crumrin remembered Vicky's detailed description of the burn site, specifically her mention of the towering maple tree that had provided cover during Charlotte's cremation. At the alleged burn site near the Wabash River, That same maple tree still stood, approximately 30 feet tall and decades old. Crumrin wondered, could this tree hold evidence of what had happened beneath its branches? He contacted the University of Illinois requesting help from their botany and chemistry departments. Dr. Eugene Himmelich, a plant biologist, and Dr. Donald Dickerson, an organic chemist, arrived to examine the tree. Their theory was groundbreaking. Trees create annual growth rings that record environmental conditions year by year. If a massive fire had burned diesel fuel and petroleum products beneath this tree in 1981, traces of those chemicals might be preserved in that year's growth ring. The scientists carefully cut 5 branches from different sides of the maple tree. Under microscopic examination, they counted backward through the growth rings to 1981. What they discovered was extraordinary. The 1981 growth ring was dramatically thinner than previous years, indicating the tree had been stressed or poisoned that year. But the real breakthrough came when they ground the branch samples into sawdust and analyzed them using a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. The results were unprecedented. Hydrocarbons consistent with diesel fuel were present in the 1981 growth rings. Even more remarkably, only the 2 branches on the side of the tree facing the alleged burn site contained these petroleum traces, exactly matching Vicky McAllister's description of where Fred had positioned the burning drum. This was more than just corroborating evidence. It was scientific proof that a large petroleum-fueled fire had burned at that exact location in 1981, precisely as Vicky McAllister had described. The tree had been an unwitting witness all along, absorbing the chemical evidence of Charlotte's cremation and preserving it in its very DNA. For the first time in legal history, a tree was about to testify in a murder trial. In 1984, armed with Vicky McAllister's explosive testimony, Charlotte's letters from the bank safe deposit box, and groundbreaking scientific evidence from the maple tree, authorities finally felt they had enough proof to arrest Fred Grabbe for the murder of his wife. The arrest sent shockwaves through the small community of Marshall, Illinois, where Fred had maintained his reputation as a successful businessman and pillar of the community. The case would make legal history as the first murder trial to use forensic botany as evidence. The trial that began in 1985 was unprecedented in many ways. Not only was it a murder case with no body, but it also featured 3 distinct lines of evidence that had never been combined before: a victim's own written prediction of her death, revolutionary scientific testimony from a tree, and the detailed account of an eyewitness to murder. The prosecution faced the unique challenge of weaving together these different types of evidence into a compelling narrative of premeditated murder. Fred's defense team, led by experienced criminal attorneys, immediately attacked the credibility of the prosecution's key witness. They argued that Vicky McAllister was a scorned woman seeking revenge against her former lover. They questioned her motives for waiting 3 years to come forward and suggested that her testimony was fabricated. However, they were completely unprepared for the 2 other lines of evidence that would corroborate her story in ways they never expected. The prosecution's case began with Charlotte's own words. In dramatic courtroom testimony, investigators read aloud the letters Charlotte had written just days before her disappearance. "Fred and I are getting a divorce, and I'm not sure I will not be killed through all of this." Written in Charlotte's own handwriting and sealed in a bank vault, these letters carried the weight of a message from beyond the grave. The centerpiece of the prosecution's scientific case was the groundbreaking testimony of Dr. Eugene Himmelich and Dr. Donald Dickerson, who explained how the maple tree near the Wabash River had preserved chemical evidence of Charlotte's cremation. The jury listened in fascination as the scientists described how trees create annual growth rings and how hydrocarbon traces from 1981 had been preserved in the tree's cellular structure. This testimony provided scientific validation for what Charlotte had predicted and what Vicky had witnessed. When the prosecution presented the gas chromatograph results showing diesel fuel traces in only the branches facing the alleged burn site, it created powerful corroboration of Vicky McAllister's testimony. The tree evidence didn't just support her story. It proved that every detail she had described was scientifically accurate, right down to the exact location of the burning barrel. Jeffrey's testimony was particularly powerful when combined with his mother's written words. As Charlotte's son, Jeffrey confirmed that his mother had indeed been increasingly fearful in the weeks before her disappearance, exactly as she had described in her letters. His account of Fred's violent tendencies corroborated Charlotte's written fears and provided a human face to the domestic violence that had escalated to murder. Vicki McAllister's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case, but now it carried the weight of both Charlotte's words and scientific evidence. Over several days, she recounted in graphic detail what she claimed to have witnessed on July 24, 1981. Her testimony was consistent, detailed, and delivered with apparent sincerity. Most importantly, every aspect of her story, from the location of the burning to the method of disposal, was now backed by either Charlotte's own written concerns or scientific evidence from the maple tree. The combination of three independent lines of evidence, Charlotte's own written prediction, revolutionary scientific proof, and detailed eyewitness testimony, proved overwhelming. The defense had no answer for Charlotte's letters, written in her own hand. They couldn't argue with scientific analysis preserved in tree rings, and they couldn't explain how Vicki could have known details that were later scientifically validated. After deliberations, the jury found Fred Grabbe guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on September 11, 1985. The verdict sent a clear message that justice could be served even in the most challenging cases. Charlotte's own words had reached from beyond the grave to secure her husband's conviction. Science had spoken through the rings of a maple tree, and a witness had found the courage to tell the truth. Together, these three voices had achieved what seemed impossible: justice for Charlotte Grabbe. Fred Grabbe's conviction and life sentence should have been the end of the story, but his ability to manipulate women didn't end when he was locked behind bars. While awaiting his sentencing in the Clark County Jail, Fred began a relationship with another woman, Barbara Graham, a 26-year-old who became obsessed with the convicted killer. Barbara's infatuation with Fred was so intense that she was willing to risk everything to help him escape from custody. On July 7, 1985, Barbara Graham attempted what can only be described as one of the most desperate and poorly planned jailbreaks in Illinois history. The 26-year-old woman arrived at the Clark County Jail armed with a gun, apparently believing she could simply shoot her way in and free Fred from custody. The escape attempt was chaotic and violent. When a deputy sheriff tried to stop her, Barbara shot him in the leg. The wounded officer survived the attack, and Barbara was immediately apprehended at the scene. The 26-year-old girlfriend of a convicted murderer was ordered held in $1 million bond for allegedly shooting a deputy sheriff in the leg in what authorities described as a futile and dangerous attempt to break Fred out of jail. The escape attempt failed completely. Barbara was immediately arrested and faced serious felony charges for assault with intent to commit murder, attempted murder of a police officer, and attempting to aid an escape. Fred remained in his cell, his life sentence intact, while his latest victim joined him in facing serious prison time. The incident only served to reinforce the prosecution's portrayal of Fred as a dangerous manipulator who drew vulnerable women into his web of violence. Fred Grabbe's legal team immediately filed an appeal of his murder conviction, arguing that the innovative forensic botany evidence should not have been admissible in court. They claimed the tree analysis was too experimental and unreliable to be used in a criminal trial. The appeal process would drag on for years, keeping the case in the headlines and the wounds fresh for Charlotte's family. In 1987, Fred Grabbe's appeal was successful. The Illinois Appellate Court ruled that the conviction should be overturned due to irregularities in jury selection during the original trial. Fred was granted a new trial, and his murder conviction was temporarily overturned. During this time, Jeffrey Grabbe, Charlotte's son who had been a key witness against Fred, continued to live with the trauma of his mother's disappearance and the knowledge of Fred's abuse throughout his childhood. The stress of the ongoing legal proceedings, combined with his own personal struggles and financial difficulties, was taking a severe toll on the young man. Jeffrey had not worked steadily since his mother's death and was facing mounting debts. Then, in March 1988, tragedy struck the family again. Jeffrey Grabbe went missing under circumstances that would raise questions and suspicions. According to his wife Cindy, Jeffrey was working as a financier and had gone to California to seek a loan for a client. They had been speaking daily because their baby son had pneumonia, but Jeffrey suddenly stopped calling. On March 21st, 1988, a boater discovered a body in the Pacific Ocean, 1.5 miles off Seal Beach, California. The victim had been shot 3 times, tied to an anchor, and thrown fully clothed into the ocean. This was clearly a murder, not an accidental drowning. The body was identified as Jeffrey Grabbe on May 24th, 1988, using dental records and a forensic reconstruction. According to police investigations, Jeffrey's murder was not related to his testimony against his father. Instead, detectives determined that Jeffrey had become involved in a $7 million money laundering scheme and was killed when he tried to double-cross his business associates. The Seal Beach police concluded this was a drug-related killing, separate from the Fred Grabbe murder case. Despite the tragic loss of Jeffrey and the overturned conviction, prosecutors were determined to retry Fred Grabbe for Charlotte's murder. The second trial began in March 1988 and would have to rely primarily on Vicki McAllister's testimony, Charlotte's letters, and other circumstantial evidence, since Jeffrey was no longer available to testify about the pattern of abuse. The second trial did not exclude the forensic botany evidence entirely. The appellate court had overturned the conviction based on jury instruction errors, not because the tree evidence was ruled inadmissible. However, the defense continued to challenge the scientific methodology. Vicki McAllister once again took the stand and recounted her horrific account of witnessing Charlotte's murder. Her testimony remained consistent with her previous account, describing in graphic detail how Fred had repeatedly strangled Charlotte, then desecrated her body before burning her remains under the maple tree by the Wabash River. The prosecution still had Charlotte's letters from the safe deposit box, which remained powerful evidence of her fears and her accurate prediction of her own death. They also presented evidence of Fred's history of domestic violence and his motive to silence Charlotte before she could expose his questionable business activities. After deliberation, the jury in the second trial once again found Fred Grabbe guilty of murder in April 1988. However, this time he received a sentence of 75 years in prison instead of life without parole. The conviction was a victory for Charlotte's family and vindicated their long fight for justice, even without Jeffrey's testimony. Fred would spend the next 34 years of his life behind bars, serving time for the murder of his wife, Charlotte. During his decades in prison, he maintained his innocence, never admitting to the crime that had torn apart his family and shocked the small community of Marshall, Illinois. In July 2022, after serving 34 years of his 75-year sentence, 83-year-old Fred Grabbe was released from Dixon Correctional Center in Illinois on mandatory supervised release. His release was not a parole decision, but an automatic release based on Illinois sentencing guidelines after serving the required portion of his sentence. The Wabash River still flows along the Illinois-Indiana border. Charlotte's ashes rest somewhere in its waters. Her body has never been found. The maple tree told the story that Charlotte could no longer tell herself, written in its very rings. Charlotte is gone, but the story is not over. Every leaf on the maple tree and every ripple in the river carries a piece of her story, the story of a woman who faced fear with the truth and left knowing her voice would haunt her killer forever.